your preferences. So we're going to go to File, Project Window. Hit the New button. Put it inside your 2540 folder. Inside your work folder. Now I'm going to call mine Sarcona_BallBounce. Okay, so you went to File, Project Window, put it inside your fall, whatever it was, fall 2015, your 2540, your work folder, and give it a name. Okay. Then we're going to create a sphere, and for this one, I'm going to use a NURB sphere. Okay, you could use a polygon too. But I just want to use NURBS because I like having the less divisions in it, and I can tweak some stuff after the fact if I wanted to. Okay.
NURBS.
So what we're going to do is, again, I don't like my objects to be sitting halfway into the grid. I like my objects to be sitting on the grid like the grid is a ground. Yes, sir.
Isn't there a way we can change that, like in a presets, to where it sits on the grid, or no?
No. You could write a script that would automatically do it. So we're going to take our translate y and put that up to 1. Okay, so I just went to 1, translate y, there it is. Now I don't like my translate y 1 to be where he's on the grid, so what do I do to fix that? Freeze transforms. We go to Modify, Freeze Transformations, go in the option box, make sure Translate's clicked, and freeze it. So now that we have this, we're going to make him just bounce. That's all we want him to do. Okay, so we're going to focus in on one attribute at a time. So what we're doing is, remember last time we were setting keyframes, we could right click on Translate Y and do key selected, but the faster way to do that is to go to the animation menu, and under key, set key option box, we could do the all keyable attributes from channel box. Okay. And that way, when I hit the S key, it'll set just the Translate Y keyframes. Okay? So key, set key option box, all keyable attributes from channel box. I have my Translate Y clicked. I hit set key. Okay? So now we've set our first key on Translate Y. Now, just like before, am I going too fast? If you were to accidentally not do that and then you hit set key and it's set key for everything, then you just realize that you did it and you just go and change that anyway. Okay, so just be aware that it's not the end of the world if you don't. All right, so we don't remember, or we don't know how long this is going to be. What are some factors to take into account of how many frames it's going to be between each bounce? Speed. How far, right. So how high up he goes and how high or how far he falls is going to be a key factor into that. So for me, if I went 10 frames and went up this high, that might be good. If you went 10 frames and went that high, that might be too quick. Okay? So it's all going to come down to everyone's individual file. So don't look at my numbers and say you typed in 4, I'm going to type in 4. Okay? Get to the point where you can look at it and say, yes, that looks like a natural movement of the bounce. Okay. Now we also have to decide too, like, what kind of ball is this? Is it a tennis ball? Is it a bowling ball? Obviously, those are going to bounce differently, right? So this is more of just a cartoony kind of ball, more like a not a beach ball, but like one of those like super bounce squishy ball things. Okay. What was that? Sure. So something like that. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up. Now watch what I do here, and then we're going to undo it. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to set my keyframes for that. So if I go to 10 and I pull this up and I set a key, and then I go to 20 and I pull it back down, and I say, okay, that's at 0. There we go. And I set another key, and then I go up to 30 and I pull this up, and then I set a key, and then I go over to 40. And I put that back to 0. I click on that and I set a key. Do you see how repetitive and kind of pointless is what I'm doing is? right? Because I'm constantly going up, setting keys, going down, setting keys. It would be nice if I could just set all my bottom keys and then set all my top keys, right? Wouldn't that be easier to do all at once? So that's what we're gonna do. Watch this magic. Shift middle mouse. I can marquee all my keys inside here and then right click and delete. Wonderful. Okay. So what I want to do is I'm going to go through and set all of my bottom keyframes. I know that every 10 frames I'm doing something. Okay. So if I'm at 1 right now, where's my next bottom keyframe? 20. So if I go up to 20 and hit S, then go up to 40 and hit S, then go up to 60 and hit S, then go up to 80 and hit S. Okay? So I've set all my bottom keyframes. So every time he's at 20, 40, 60, and 80 and 1, he is at the bottom. Okay? So now I'm going to go to what to set my first up one? 10. 10. Because 20 was the bottom.
Oh, okay.
Okay? So 10, now let's pull it up. Now again, use your imagination. What number do you want to go? I wouldn't go any higher than 10 just because of how far and fast that's going to move. And then also considering the end game of rendering this out, you don't want to render something out that changes that much altitude really quick. Okay? So I'm going to go up to 8-ish. You can pick something however much you want and adjust it later. Okay? The point is, just like before, we block it out, right? We do as quick as we can, just block out all these frames, and then we can go back and tweak all those frames. All right. So I put them at 8-ish. I'm going to hit S to set my key. All right. So now where am I going to go to set my next upper keyframe?
30.
30. Now when I click on 30, what happens to him? He goes back down. Yes, sir.
Real quick, you taught me this last year. If you forget to move before moving, instead of moving the timeline first and then the object, what do you hold to move the timeline, keeping the object where it is?
Middle.
That's what we're going to do next, yes. So middle mouse. So we go back to 10, and then we middle mouse button click on 30, and you'll see that the timeline adjusts, but not the actual object. So then I can hit S again, and the object will stay right where he was at 10. Okay, so I've reset my top one at the same exact value. Then I can go to 50 with the middle mouse and set a key. Then go to 70 with the middle mouse and set a key. So now I've set all my lowers and I've set all my uppers. So if we were to hit play, it would bounce like that. Now I think mine's playing back too fast, so I'm going to right click on my timeline, go to playback speed, and make sure it's set to play every frame max real time. Okay. So now what's one thing that's wrong with this? Or what looks weird?
It doesn't look realistic.
It doesn't look realistic, it's static.
It looks like it's floating.
It's floating is what it looks like, right? And we don't get a sense of any impact or any velocity change, right? So let's look at our example on the board. We don't see any of that energy being conveyed. It just looks like Talena said, he's kind of floating, just kind of like going up and down, right? So let's give him a little bit more motion, a little bit more drive into what he's doing. All right, so we're going to go to the graph editor, Window, Animation Editor's Graph Editor, or you can go to your hotbox or your shelf item if you have it and click on it. Okay, I'm going to hit F so I can see my graph. All right, so now with this graph, it looks exactly like we talked about. It's just floating. It's just going up and down. So now we're going to make one change in here, and it's going to change the way it looks inside of that. So if I marquee all of these bottom points, and I make them linear, which is this little linear tangent button, and then we watch it again.
Look like it's bouncing now.
Right. Now it looks more like it's bouncing. It still doesn't look perfect, but it definitely looks a lot better than it did before. Okay? Now let's analyze that a little bit before we go any further. In this case, that's why this works, is because it hits the ground and bounces back up. Now what we can do is exaggerate this a little bit further. Okay? So right now our handles are kind of locked into position. If I click on one of these and middle drag, you can see how it grabs both of those, right? So I'm going to grab this whole mess on the bottom again, and I'm going to go up here to break tangents. Okay? It's also right click, break tangents, easy way to get to it. Now I can grab these individually and start to make this graph a bit bigger. Make this valley a little bit narrower and make the mountain or hill a little bit hillier.
Is there a way to do them all at once?
There is. If I were to go like this, I can't do them all at once, but I can do like all the pink at once. So I'm just shift marking all the pink.
Gotcha.
There's no pink there. And then grabbing those. Oops. But I like to do them individually, so that's what I'm doing. Okay.
Okay, go back. What the heck did you do?
So all we did was grab the handlebars and just bring those two handlebars closer together. We broke the tangents and brought the handlebars closer together. Let me stick this inside of my view so we can see it better.
Okay, I know that much. God damn, mine's not doing it. I can't.
Just doing that, just making all those bottom ones linear and just kind of tightening up where that valley happens makes this animation read 10 times better than it did before. Okay? So this is something that's, you know, kind of like an eye-opener, because it really makes you appreciate the delicacy of animation, okay? Where it's not simply going in there and just throwing in a bunch of keyframes and hoping for the best. It's literally about understanding the physics of it so that we can apply that to our animation and make it look realistic. Boing, boing, boing. All right. So what's another thing we could do to make this appear a little bit more realistic? Squash it? We're not at the squashing stage yet. We could move it. We're still working on Y though. We're still not perfectly happy with that Y. Okay? What about them? These ones are already flat. Okay? Now we could, just like we did in the other one, we could stretch them out and give it a little bit more exaggeration. That's one thing we could do. Specifically with this, what we want to do is he has the same constant bounce every time, right? He's always going up to that same value. Just like when we did the arm or the stick kind of waving back and forth, we didn't want everything to be the same. So what should happen to the height of these hills as it goes on?
Gradually decrease.
Gradually decrease, okay? So I'm going to go and hold down the shift key and bring that one down, bring that one down, and bring that one down. Now, depending on how far you went with your other ones, if I pull this too far down, look what happens to my curve.
It turns into an M.
Right, it turns into an M, which obviously we lose that effect. So then I just have to go back to my little handlebars here and just adjust these points. Okay, so it doesn't do exactly that.
Yeah, 'cause mine's doing
The time, okay? So they're bouncing up to 8 units or so the first time, and it's taking 20 frames, right? So it takes 10 frames up, 10 frames down. The next one in mine is only going to like 7. It still takes 10 frames up and 10 frames down. The next one's going to 5, 10 frames up, 10 frames down. And the last one is going to 1, still 10 frames up and 10 frames down. You can really see the exaggeration in that last one of how slow it's supposed to go. So we have to look at the values and how far they're moving and how fast and all this stuff to get them to move correctly. Now what I like to do is look at that first curve. Look at my first curve here and see how the shape of it, right? It's kind of like this more pointy mountain, where the second one is maybe a little bit wider mountain. The third one is more of like a rounded mountain, and this last one is more of like an anthill, okay? So the way I look at it is that first shape, the profile of that first one should be duplicated and just kind of scaled down to the other ones, all right? So watch what I mean by that. If I take this one, that's the shape I'm going to try to emulate. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to pull this over. So I'm just grabbing all this and pulling it over. Now do you see how this mountain here looks pretty much like that mountain, only smaller? Okay, I'll do the same thing on the next one. Maybe like that. And then like that. How do you shrink tangents? Well, we can grab them and make them linear again, and that will shrink them. It'll kind of reset them. And then we can grab these and just pull them back up here.
But there's not a way to actually bring them in.
There is. I'll show that in a second too.
How are you moving?
I'm just grabbing the handle and then middle mouse button clicking.
Not that. I mean, move the-
Oh, this?
I mean, move the whole thing.
Like that?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just grabbing more than one key and then holding shift and just middle dragging left. Remember, shift is going to be your constraint for up and down and left and right. Alright, so now with some more tweaking, we can keep playing with this until we're happy with the exact look of just that translate Y. Now the other thing we can do is we can grab all of the keyframes, we can right click and make them weighted tangents, and then we can right click and make them free tangent weights. And what that means is that we can grab the handlebars and stretch them out as far as we want, or pull them in as far as we want. Okay? So sometimes what helps is playing around with these to look and just see what different things look like. Like for this one, by taking the graph, let me make this bigger so you can see it, and making it like this, what I'm going to get is this really quick vertical movement. It's going to shoot straight up, then it's going to hang out for a second, not a real second, but hang out for a couple frames, and then fall back down. Okay? So that's another way that we can kind of play with things and just see what does it look like, because that's going to be your biggest challenge, is just kind of playing around with stuff, because sometimes you just want the answer. Sometimes we want to just like, what's the answer? What do I need to punch in to get this to work? And for 3D animation people, we can't always do that. Sometimes we have to just play with it to see what's going to give us the best results. So with this one, you can see boing, 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 boing. It actually like stays up a bit longer, right? Like shoots up and then hangs out at the top a little bit longer and then falls down. The other thing I could do is go the opposite way. Oops. Or both ways. I can make both of these up like this. Okay, and it gives a different feel to the ball. It's not simply just about, making the ball here, then here, then here, then here. It's about customizing what the ball is doing throughout the entire process. Okay. Now there's some people, some animators who will go through, and a lot of the work we've done has been in the graph editor, but we also started inside of our view. There are some animators that will do everything right inside the graph editor. They'll go to the end of this, and if they switched it, move nearest point. There it is, insert keys. So here, what I can do is just insert some keys. And then just grab these and manually just move these up. Move that up. Break the tangents. Free the tangent weight. And you see how I'm doing all of this basically by graph editor stuff. I haven't even added any keyframes inside of the actual Maya view. I've just done it all within the graph editor. Okay. Now the trick to this too is to keep some nice, consistently smooth graphs. If I have any kinks in the graph, that's going to come off as looking weird. If I took this curve here and I just did one of those numbers to it, let me make it a little more exaggerated so you can see it. There you go. You can see it now where it doesn't look specifically what we want. Now I exaggerated it so you could see it more clearly, but sometimes it's not as obvious. Sometimes it's literally going to be this. It's going to be that, okay? Or sometimes it's just this little twist that you have inside here that really makes your animation read a bit better, okay? So it takes a lot of time just to go through and play around with all of these settings. Now at this point, I'm satisfied with the translate Y, okay? Now we can move on to the next phase of this. And for us, the next phase could be anything. We're going to take this and do the translate X before we do anything else. Okay, so I'm going to pull it back in X to -12 and set a keyframe at frame 1. Then I'll go to the end of my animation, wherever my translate Y keyframe stopped, wherever the last red tick is, and I'll set my last keyframe at there. Okay, so I went from -12. In my case, I went to about 10. All right, now you could also do translate Z. The cool thing about doing this method is that once you have that Y set up, you can have it go in translate X, translate Z, pretty much any direction. All right, so what's looking wrong in mine? Why does this look weird?
Slows down too quick at the end.
It slows down too quick at the end, and there's actually like a
hiccup on like a third balance.
Right. Well, what's happening too is that it's speeding up. It's slowing down at the beginning. It's like accelerating and then speeding up and then slowing down again. With this kind of jump, this kind of velocity, I'm not seeing a whole lot of like a need for it to slowly speed up. So if I look in the graph editor, you'll see that it's starting to get a bit complex. You'll see that I'm seeing the translate X and the translate Y. But by clicking on these, I can isolate them individually. So I can look at just the translate X or just the translate Y. So I'm going to look at just the translate X, and in this case I want to grab the start keyframe and make that linear, or just grab it and just manually adjust it. Okay? That way I can control a fast motion to a slower motion. At the beginning of the animation he goes pretty quick and then he starts to slow down. Okay? So now it's going to look a little bit more realistic, because that momentum from that bounce is now projecting him forward a little bit faster. Okay? The smaller bounces, he's not moving as fast or as far. The longer bounces, the more powerful bounces, he's moving pretty quick.
Okay, you get what again?
All right. So now as you're looking at graphs too, pay attention to not what my graph looks like, but pay more attention to what my graph is doing. Because if my graph is like this, it's going to look a lot different than if my graph is like that. Okay? So you see how I'm changing the display of my graph by just changing how it's scaling it. So you can't really look at my graph and say, what's his graph doing? Let me make mine like that. You have to look at the animation. You have to look at what the movement is and try to emulate that. So if we're moving fast, typically we're going to have a lot of vertical movement. Okay? If we're moving slow, we're going to have a lot more horizontal movement. All right, so now that we have our translate x and we have our translate y, now we can add some rotation into this. Okay? Now for the rotation, we're going to do the same exact thing we did for the x. Okay? Now we have to know which direction the rotate is going to go, because we don't want to set keyframes for all the rotates. All right? So in my case, I'm looking at the blue direction. Okay? The blue is the rotate Z, so that's what I'm going to set keyframes on. So I'm going to click on rotate Z. I'm at frame 1. I set a key. I go to the end. I rotate it around a couple times. I set a key. Okay? And then I'm going to do the exact same thing on the graph that I did for the other one. It speeds up and then slows down. Okay, so now that we have the translate, we have the translate x and y, and we have the rotate z, now if we were to add squash to it, here's where it gets tricky. Okay, in order for us to add squash to this, how would we do that? Okay, so let's say I scaled this down like that. Now what happened to him? He's not touching the ground. And then when I hit play, it's like a pancake flopping around. Okay? So there's several different ways that we can do the actual squash to it. One of the ways, and this is the way that we're going to do it for this assignment, involves ensuring that the rotations are all set up. If we want to create that type of motion on the ball, we can't have him becoming like this little coin or pancake that's flipping around. Okay? So I'm just going to reset that to 1. There we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to check his rotations. Because what I want is when he rotates, every time he rotates, he's rotating 180 degrees. Okay? Now watch what it's going to do for mine. So I'm going to set his rotation here at 0, which is already done. And then when I go to 20, you can see in this case he's already at negative 465. Okay? So what that means is that in order for him to do something like that, he's got to be constrained to a certain direction. Because otherwise he's going to be flipping, right, as he rotates. So I'm going to set this to negative 180. And then I'm going to set a key for this. Then I'm going to go to 40. And then what's negative 180 minus 180? Negative 360. So I'll set another key there. Wait, why is he in the air? Oops, that's why. I went to the wrong spot. There he goes. There. When he's on the ground, that's what I wanted. Okay. Key selected. Then I go to the next time he's on the ground. And then that would be negative 540. Okay? And then inside the graph editor, I'm getting this funky little curve here. I'm just going to grab this whole thing and make sure it's nice and smooth. There we go. Okay? So now what I get, look at that rotation there. Okay? See how it looks like he's just kind of like flipping, right, between each bounce. Now when I do my pancake, he's still off the ground, which is fine. it looks a little bit more natural when I do the next couple steps, okay? So watch it again, how I do the squashing, and then we'll do it together. And that last one is just way too much, but that'll be fine. All right, so in order for me to squash him, I'm going to save it before I do any squashing. I have to squash him and then make it work. Now, does this look like he's squashed?
No.
What would make him look more squashed?
He's actually touching the ground.
Okay. So if I go to the graph editor, I can grab that translate Y and pull it down. Oops. Pull it down until he's touching the ground.
Is there a way that you can use keystrokes?
What do you mean?
Like the arrow
Oh.
keys? What did you say?
I can use the Alt down arrow to move it, and then to just reset a keyframe on the Y. That works. So Alt left or Alt arrow keys allow me to move the object up and down
Oh.
and get it lined up. Okay. So now does that look like he's squished?
Yes. Now it does.
So if I went like this, does that look like he's squishing? Or would it look better if he also did this?
He spread out more.
Right? Okay. So in order for me to get him to squash, I'm going to have to do a couple things. So I'm going to undo all that. Just reset this back to 0. Reset this back to 1. There we go. Okay. So in order for me to get him to squash correctly, I'm going to isolate some of these other attributes. So here's some other tools that we can use. So I can grab all of these items here. I can right click. Whoa, I just deleted it all. I can right click and I can say mute selected. And what that's going to do is it mutes those items so that they're no longer being updated. As I hit play, you can see my animation's gone. Okay, it's still there, it's just hidden or muted right now so we can't see it. So I'm going to focus in on just that translate Y. Okay, so I'm going to unmute that one. There we go. I'm also going to give myself, in this case, just a little bit of room. So I'm going to scoot this over a couple frames. There we go. So I've given myself a little bit of time beforehand just to give myself a little bit of squishing time. Okay? So he's going to start off here perfectly round, and I'm going to keyframe all three scales. Okay? And the translate Y. Then I'm going to go to 3, and I'm going to scale him down like this, scale him out like that, and then push him down like that. Okay, so now he's touching the ground. So now I can hit S to set a key. So now let's just watch that little squishing part. So there he is, just squishing down. Okay. Now let me mute the X and the Z. Mute selected. Now this is what it looks like without the moving down. Do you see how it looks like weird? How he's just kind of like scaling this way? It's not scaling and coming out. It's not squashing enough. So by taking the scale X and the scale Z and adding that into it, we get more of a sense that he's actually squashing. That as he comes down shorter, he's actually pulling out as well. So it gives us more of that squash look to it. Okay? And then when he goes up, okay, so here he is squashed. And then when he goes up like this at 5 or so, maybe at 4. Okay. Then I'm going to go the opposite direction. So I'm going to scale him out like this. I'm going to scale him in like this. I'm going to move him up like that. Okay, so now you get more of a sense of that thing actually launching. You get a sense of it squashing down and then launching straight up. Okay, this is probably going to be the hardest part for you. Let me focus in on that. There you go, right about there. The hardest part for you to get is just doing this kind of thing. Is just understanding how these attributes are working together. Even though we've set translate Y keyframes, we're overwriting them in order for this thing to line up correctly. Okay? Now, as he comes up to the top, as he gets to the peak of this, he shouldn't be stretched out anymore. He's lost all that energy. So he's going to be back to being round again. Okay, so I just made him round again and hit S to set a key. So now, there he goes. So he squashes and pushes off. Turns into a ball. And then as he comes back down, what did we say was going to happen to him right before he hits the ground?
Hey guys, stretch out again.
Stretched out again. So now we go back to right before he hits the ground at 22. And I'm going to pull him up. I'm going to scale him in a little bit. Maybe going to move him down a little bit more. Okay. And then I'll S to set a key on those and S to set a key on the Y. Because I moved all of those, I want all of those to have it. When he hits the ground, what should he be doing?
Flattening.
Flattening. So we stretch him out like that. We squish him in like that. We make sure in the front view that he's actually touching the ground. There we go. We reset a key. And then we go to the frame after. And he's back to squished in, stretched out, setting a key. Okay, so now let's look at just that little area there. Oops, maybe a little bit more. Okay, so now you're getting more of a sense of him actually bouncing. You get a sense of he has a little bit more weight to him. He squishes, he goes up. He loses his momentum, turns back to a ball, starts to fall down, starts to stretch out. He hits the ground, and then bounces back up again. Okay? Now, one of the things that's kind of sucky about this is that he's not really on the ground long enough for that bounce to really take effect in our mind. It looks weird because we don't really see that squash happening, right? It's kind of difficult to see. As an animator, we have to go through and make things more visible. Even though in our mind, it might say that this thing isn't happening, or in our rational sense, it doesn't seem like it should be happening, we still should put some things in there to make it more likely of what's actually going on. So one of the things that we can do is when he goes and hits the ground, instead of just having this one keyframe where he hits the ground and squashes, it would work good if we had two keyframes there. Okay, so if I went and I right-clicked and copied this keyframe, and then I went to my 24 here. Where's my 24? Let me use a tracks editor for this. Not the tracks editor, sorry, dope sheet. Okay, so there's my 24. I'm just going to scoot it over one. And then I'm just going to go back to 23 or 24 and then paste that keyframe in. Okay. All right, so now we just get an extra keyframe there, and that's just going to give us a little bit more better read. Okay, so now we can see that happening. That little squash is staying there for an extra frame, and it's making it a bit easier for us to read that squash happening. Now what I'm going to do is unfreeze the rotate Z, or unmute. Okay, now it looks kind of weird. Why is it doing that? But let's go to unmute the translate X. Okay, and now we're really getting a sense of this whole thing kind of taking shape and seeing how this is flowing together. Okay, so this coming up, and then stretching, and then hitting, and then coming up again. Okay, now this doesn't seem like it's really lined up good. So I'm going to go to my scales here, And my scales, I set them all together. So typically when I edit them, I'm editing them all together. Now looking at the scales, you can see in this case, that's that. All right, in this case, the blue here is at about 1.3. The green here is about 0.628. Okay, I try to keep them pretty even and consistent. On this side, the blue is at 1.4 and the green is at 0.975. Okay, so I want to pull this down further. I'm going to pull this down further. There we go. Okay, so I'm just pulling those down just so they're a little bit more consistent with where they should be. All right, so now what I can do is take these and maybe pull this in, pull this in. Just like we did on the other one, they should gradually become less and less. Okay, so now this is starting to look a little more bouncy, a little bit more squashy and stretchy because we're exaggerating some of these movements. Okay, now if that rotate wasn't there, remember that rotate that we had set up before? Animation, graph editor, rotate. If I delete the rotate keyframes and we're back to where we were before with this, you can see how it's not landing correctly. It's coming up. That looks okay, but then we're kind of like overshooting it, and by the time we get squashed, we're kind of like sideways. Okay? So that obviously that doesn't work. So that's why we did that rotate. There we go. That rotates so that it looks correct. Now there is like a sliding happening here, which I'm not really fond of. So I could also go into my graph editor, find my translate X, and just set a keyframe for it. Okay, so this keyframe at 24 should be the same one at 23. So the 23 is at -0.8. So here, -0.8. And so now I shouldn't get any sliding. There we go. So you can see he just stays right there and squashes. And again, it helps reinforce that shape into our brain. 1/30th of a second is very hard for our brains to see. So by kind of helping it along by doubling it, it just kind of reinforces that into what we're seeing. Okay. What else? Oh, the other way we can do a squash, just so you can see it, is under the deform rigging ones. There are these deformers, and one of them is a squash. Okay, and the way this works is that we have this factor that allows us to squash this object, and you can see it's pretty much doing exactly what we're doing, but it's doing it with one number here. Okay, so we could have used this squash factor on here to create that stretching and squashing to get it all lined up. Okay, so that is a possibility as well, to do something like that. We could even take this, come on, and squash it like that, or stretch it like that. And we could add another deformer like a bend. And let me get rid of that. And we can have this thing kind of bend a little bit. Okay, so now we can actually give it a little bit more direction by having it do something like this. I think that's all the ones that we would use. What was that? Yeah. Yeah, so for this, that's pretty much what we could use for something like that. That's another way we could do it, but that would get more into the rigging area, which we're not at yet. Okay, so for when we do this, all we're going to be doing is just animating those properties.
So we can use a squash if we want?
You could use a squash if you want. Okay. Now when you use something like that, it has to be parented. So if I just, to show you, if I took this and I muted these, and I go to the squash, there it is, and I hit play, it just goes away, okay? So I have to take this squash deformer, shift click the object, and parent it, hit P. So now it's going to go with it. Whoops. I did it backwards.
I do that all the time.
This first, then this, P. Nope.
I had to use constraint.
I don't want to use constraint. I want it to work the way it should work. Let me unmute everything. Oh, it didn't like that it was muted. Whatever. Alright, so I'll just delete those scales, and now it'll go with it, okay? So then I could use this squash right here and use that factor to control that, okay? In the same way that I use the other one. So right here, we're back to 0. Then we would go up a couple frames, and then squash it, like that. And then go up a frame, and then stretch it. Go up to where it's here, put that back to 0. Go here. Go there. Oops. There we go.
This way seems a lot more quicker and more exact, I'd say, than the other.
Trying to stretch it out.
Right. Either way is acceptable. They're doing the same exact thing. Okay. This way you do get one, which is nice. And then you also have these other controls. So you can control the smoothness of it. So if you feel that you're not getting, the shape that you want, you can kind of adjust that afterwards. You can expand it so you can kind of, elongate it even further or stretch it out. So you do get some more benefits apart from the other one that we would just do that. So if you would like to use that squash, you can use a squash. Just don't mute anything, or obviously it won't work anymore. Okay. So now for the other part of this, when you're doing your rolling part, in order for us to do the rolling, we want 2 seconds of rolling to happen before this and 2 seconds of rolling to happen after this. So we don't have 2 seconds of rolling right here. Okay. So I'm going to go to my dope sheet and move all of my stuff down so that I have enough room. To at least 60, exactly. So now we have nothing happening until 60, and then it starts moving. So all I have to do now is just grab this, pull it back some, and then set a key on the translate X. Okay. Now the distance I pulled it back was too far, because what's happening is it speeds up like super quick, and then it slows down when it does its rolling or its bouncing. It doesn't make really a lot of sense. So let's go and pull this a little bit closer. Yeah, still probably a little bit closer. And maybe a little bit further. Okay, so it's going to be this game of just back and forth. Okay, so that's its movement. Now I need to go play with the rotation. For the rotation, I know that going forward, I'm going actually negative rotations. So back here, I want to go into positive rotations. Positive that way. Okay, and then I'll set another key. Okay, so now you can see how that rolling happens, and it transitions right into it. So what we don't want to do is set up the rolling, then set up this, and then set up the other rolling. Set up the main area first, just like I did. Set up that translate Y, get the translate Y perfect. then do your translate X or Z, whichever one you're doing. Then do the rotate. Then do the squash. Once those 4 are done, then you can go ahead and do the beginning part and then the ending part by just moving those keyframes over. Okay? Now what's cool about this part is that you should try to figure out a way to incorporate like why is it bouncing? Because we don't want to just like it bounces for fun, because it's okay to do that, and that's, like I said before, like the minimum. But we could add other stuff into this mix. We could add like a cube. And this is just a very quick reason of why he's bouncing, because there's a cube in the way, right? So he's rolling, and he jumps over the cube, okay? Or you could have a ring. We can go into the torus. Woo! So he's jumping over a cube and through a ring, so he's extra fancy. Okay, so now don't do a ring and a cube. Find something else to do. Find another reason of why he's doing it. I've had people have like little platforms. He's rolling along, he hits his platform, and the platform propels him up, and that kind of launches him into what he's doing. Okay, or you can have a ramp, or you could have kind of like in the After Effects class, we're doing Angry Birds, so they have like openings, like cavities where this thing would be going. Okay, and some people have done just a really cool rendering, but it's just the jump, just the bouncing. Okay, so just try to think of something, a cool way to add it in there. The important thing is not the environment. The important thing is the animation. That's what I'm going to be looking at first of all. Okay, the secondary stuff of that is the secondary stuff. So don't spend too much time on the backgrounds without putting in the effort on the animation part. Okay? Apart from that, everything else is going to be very, very similar to what we've already done with like the stick animation. You keep in mind those 12 principles of animation. You keep in mind the lighting that we talked about and the shading we talked about. We don't want to have a crazy amount of coloration on this, especially for something like this, because it's very difficult to read anything if you have just these crazy color combinations. Okay? Now one thing you definitely need to have on this ball, different than the stick, is that we have to have some sort of texture on it to see that it's moving, that it's rotating. If I just put a Mia on it, and I make it, let's say, copper, and I render it, there's no way for me to tell that the ball has been rotated. Okay? It's perfectly round, so as it rolls, it's going to be perfectly round the entire time. So you want to have something on there that makes it look like it's rolling. Okay? And a good way to do that is to take the color channel and connect it to a ramp or a checker or some sort of file. In this case, I'm hooking it up to a ramp. I'm going to go and set the interpolation to none. And that allows me to put this little streak in here, so that when I render this, what I should get is this little stripe that goes around the ball. Of course I don't, because on the copper I have very little weight here and too much stuff there.
Reflectivity.
There we go. That's my ramp. It's on there. That's at 1, 0. All right, let's just do glazed ceramic then. There we go.
See a difference in shade.
I have to give it a color. This is bothering me. Blue and blue. There we go. Let me hit 6 on this and see why I'm not getting my coloration. There it is. Oh, it was a VRAMP. That's why. The V ramp was going this way around it, so we couldn't see it. Switching it to a U ramp makes that line right in the center. So now when this thing rolls, I'm going to see that it's rolling because I'm going to see that line rolling around with it. Okay, so we can definitely see this ball rolling and not seeing anything, you know, funky with it. Boing. Okay, so that's going to be the only other difference in that. Everything else is going to be the same. You're still rendering out the motion blur and non-motion blur versions and putting them into After Effects side by side. And then you'll turn in the one movie for that. Okay, so you can refer back to the stick movie for how to do the motion blur stuff, or the lighting stuff, or the other texturing stuff. Okay, same thing with the camera. Don't do anything crazy with this. This is what the camera should look like. It just kind of follows it. I'm selecting my camera, I'm setting a key. It's way over here. I set another key. See how smooth my camera is? It just kind of follows it. It doesn't do one of these. Whoa, too far. Like, that's a cool shot of this. And then, oh, let me get this other shot over here. There we go. And then it'd be cool to see it right there. It looks like an eye. There we go. So we don't have any cameras like this. Whoa. Okay, that's difficult to even see what's going on. Staging was one of the important ones. This is horribly staged. We can't see what's going on. I have no idea what's even happening in here. So we delete that, and we're back to this. Okay, nice, simple animation. That's all we're looking for, okay? Now, if you're doing something for a demo reel and you wanted to kind of pizzazz it up a little bit, then maybe you would have a shot like this, where you're showing this thing bouncing over this hoop or something like that. Right. But for the turn-in, I don't want that. So, yeah, so that's where we're at. So I'm going to put this video on the server and on Canvas. You can follow it. Like I said, don't try to do everything at once. Take it in the same steps. Get that translate Y to look correct. Get the translate X to look correct. Get the rotations to look correct. Get the squash to look correct. Once all those factors are there, then do your roll. Your roll is going to be like a minimal thing. Then once that's done, then you build your scene. If you need to tweak something here or there, whatever, then you can tweak it. Okay? Boing. Okay. Now you should have on these, it shouldn't just like stop bouncing. So like I said, you have 3 major bounces. Let me take my squash off of here. Okay, so 3 major bounces, doing, doing, doing. But you'll see how mine comes to a rest. 3 major ones, then it kind of trickles in and bounces into rest. 1, 2, 3, do, 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 do. Okay, that's what you want to have. You don't want it to be 1, 2, 3 stops all of a sudden, because that doesn't make sense. Okay. And there doesn't have to be a complicated story. The purpose is rolling for 2 seconds, which is 60 frames, bouncing 3 times, then the trickles, and then rolling for another 2 seconds. Okay, so he'll be rolling still after this. So after he's done rolling there, then we would go further, and he would go like this, and then like that. And he would still be rolling, but it would look obviously a lot nicer. Okay? All right, any questions? All right.